I spent 3 months staring at insurance adjustment spreadsheets from 1906. My goal was simple: prove that property owners claimed fire damage to avoid the earthquake exclusion clause. It was dry, economic research into early 20th century fraud. Then, I overlaid the claim maps with General Funston's military logs. The demolition orders didn't match the wind. The army was blowing up stone buildings miles upwind of the fire line. They weren't creating fire breaks to save the city. They were targeting specific structures that refused to burn. I thought I was looking at panic. Instead, I was looking at a predetermined grid. And that grid wasn't designed to stop a disaster. It was designed to ensure the total erasure of the past. I didn't start this investigation looking for a lost civilization. I wasn't looking for Tartaria, or hidden technology, or a grand conspiracy involving the erasure of human history. I was looking for insurance fraud. It was the most mundane, dry, bureaucratic starting point you could imagine. I was researching the economic aftermath of the 1906 San Francisco disaster for a project on early 20th century urban risk assessment. Specifically, I was interested in the earthquake clause. This was a standard stipulation in property insurance policies of the era, which stated that the companies were liable for damage caused by fire, but not for damage caused by seismic activity. It is a well-known historical footnote that after the ground stopped shaking on April 18, 1906, the city was consumed by a firestorm that lasted for 3 days. The accepted narrative, the one you will find in every textbook, every museum plaque, and every documentary produced in the last century, is that the earthquake ruptured the gas mains, overturned wood stoves, and sparked a conflagration that the shattered water mains couldn't fight. My thesis was simple. I wanted to prove that the fire narrative was exaggerated by property owners and city officials to secure insurance payouts. If the house fell down from the quake, you got nothing. If it burned down, you got paid. It was a study in financial survival, not structural anomaly. I spent weeks combing through digital archives of adjustment claims, looking at the actuarial tables, reading the desperate letters from homeowners to their agents in New York and London. I was looking for the lie, but I was looking for a small, greedy, human lie. I found something else. The shift happened on a Tuesday night. I was cross-referencing the claims against the military logs of Brigadier General Frederick Funston. Funston was the acting commander of the Pacific Division of the U.S. Army, and in the chaos following the initial shock, he took unilateral control of the city. He declared martial law. He deployed troops. And most famously, he ordered the demolition of buildings to create fire breaks. This is a matter of public record. It is not a secret. The history books frame this as a heroic, if somewhat clumsy, effort to save the city. The logic is that by blowing up a block of buildings, you starve the fire of fuel. I was reading Funston's logs to map the destruction, trying to correlate the locations of the Army's dynamiting operations with the insurance claims. I wanted to see if homeowners were bribing soldiers to blow up their already collapsed homes to simulate fire damage. But the timeline didn't work. I checked it again. I pulled up the meteorological data for April 18th and 19th, 1906. I looked at the wind patterns. A strong wind was driving the fire east and north. Standard firefighting protocol, even in 1906, dictates that you create a fire break ahead of the fire, downwind, to remove the fuel before the flames reach it. General Funston was ordering demolitions upwind. He was blowing up buildings that the fire had already passed, or buildings that were nowhere near the fire line. And he wasn't just blowing up wooden tenements that might catch a spark. The logs showed a specific, targeted focus on the financial district and the civic center. He was targeting massive stone-constructed banks, hotels, and government buildings. Structures that don't burn. Structures that act as natural fire breaks because stone does not catch fire. I stared at the screen. The cursor blinked at the end of a line in the logbook. Ordered demolition of the call building area. Explosives applied to support columns. Why? Why blow up a stone skyscraper to stop a fire? And why do it when the fire is moving away from it? I tried to dismiss it. I told myself I was looking at the fog of war. Panic, confusion, a general making bad calls in a crisis. That is the comfortable explanation. It allows us to maintain the narrative of incompetence. We love the narrative of incompetence because it feels human. We understand panic. We understand mistakes. But as I kept reading, the mistakes became too systematic. They were too organized. The explosive teams weren't running haphazardly. They were moving in a grid. They had wagon loads of black powder and dynamite, an immense amount of ordnance, ready to go almost immediately. I stopped looking at the insurance claims. I started looking at the explosives, and that's when I found the testimony regarding the water. The official story is that the earthquake broke the water mains, leaving the fire department helpless. But buried in the sub-reports of the Civil Engineering Review, a document almost nobody reads because it is hundreds of pages of pipe diameters and pressure ratings, I found reports from engineers stating that many mains were intact until the dynamiting started. The explosions, the ones meant to save the city, were the very thing that severed the arteries of its defense. That was the moment the floor dropped out. I wasn't looking at a rescue operation gone wrong. I was looking at a demolition disguised as a disaster. I needed to see it. I needed to see what they actually destroyed. I turned away from the ledgers and logs and turned toward the photographic record. I thought I knew what 1906 San Francisco looked like. We've all seen the pictures of the smoky ruins, the refugees in Golden Gate Park. But I had never looked, really looked, with the eyes of someone searching for a crime scene. I started with the most famous image of them all, the George R. Lawrence captive airship panorama. If you aren't familiar with it, it is a technological marvel of the time. Lawrence used a massive 49-pound camera suspended from a train of kites to capture a high-resolution, wide-angle shot of the ruined city from 2,000 feet in the air. The detail is staggering. You can see individual bricks. You can see the distinct skeletons of steel buildings. I downloaded the highest resolution file available from the Library of Congress. I zoomed in. I spent hours just scrolling across the desolate landscape. The first thing you notice, the thing that your brain tries to filter out because it doesn't make sense, is the emptiness. We are told this was an earthquake followed by a fire. Think about what that means physically. If a brick building shakes apart, the bricks fall down. They pile up in the street. If a stone cornice snaps off, it crashes through the sidewalk. If a building burns, the roof collapses. The floors pancake, but the walls, especially masonry walls, often remain standing as charred shells. And even if they fall, the material remains. Matter is not destroyed, it is displaced. A 10-story building creates a 10-story pile of debris. I zoomed in on the block known as the Latin Quarter. It was gone, not collapsed, not burned out, gone. The city blocks were flat. There were no piles of rubble. There were no mountains of brick. It looked as if someone had taken a massive broom and swept the city clean, right down to the bedrock. I checked the date of the photograph. It was taken roughly 2 weeks after the event. Maybe they had cleaned it up. I checked the cleanup records. In 1906, debris removal was done by horse and cart. There were no bulldozers, no excavators. The sheer logistical impossibility of moving millions of tons of stone and brick in 14 days by horse-drawn wagon became immediately apparent. To clear a single block of a collapsed masonry building by hand would take months. To clear hundreds of blocks? Impossible. So where did the building go? I zoomed in tighter, looking at the ruins that did remain. In the financial district, there were shells of buildings standing. These were the structures that the official history says were gutted by fire. I looked at the edges of the walls. In a normal fire, even a hot one, stone spalls. It cracks. It might blacken. But in the Lawrence panorama, and in the dozens of ground-level photographs I began to cross-reference, The stone wasn't just cracked, it was pulverized. It looked like it had been subjected to a massive pressure wave that turned the mortar and the masonry into dust. I started looking for the fake. This is the first thing you have to do when you find something that violates your understanding of physics. You have to assume the image is manipulated. I looked at the shadows. I checked the solar angle for late April in San Francisco. The shadows cast by the surviving steel frames aligned perfectly. I checked the grain of the image. I looked for the blur marks that indicate where a photo retoucher might have scraped the emulsion to hide rubble. I found nothing. The grain was consistent. The focus was sharp. The emptiness was real. And then I saw the contrast. In the distance, on the hills that were supposedly saved, I saw wooden houses. Some were burned, yes, but they were recognizable as houses. They had frames. They had chimneys. But in the center of the city, the area that Funston's troops had targeted, the destruction was absolute. It was molecular. The pattern didn't match a fire. Fire is organic. It jumps. It follows the wind. It leaves pockets of unburned material. This destruction was geometric. It followed the street grid, block after block of total erasure, right up to a specific street, and then nothing. Normal buildings. I pulled up a map of the demolition orders I had compiled from Funston's logs and overlaid it on the Lawrence panorama. The overlay clicked into place like a key in a lock. The areas of total pulverization, the areas where the rubble was inexplicably missing, were the exact areas where the Army had been operating with their black powder. But black powder doesn't turn granite into dust. Dynamite blows things apart. It doesn't vaporize them. The official narrative says they were using explosives to stop the fire. My eyes told me they were using something else, or using the explosives in a way that we aren't being told, to achieve a level of clearance that shouldn't be possible. I was looking at a city that looked less like it had been hit by a natural disaster, and more like it had been hit by the aerial bombardments of Dresden or Hiroshima 40 years later. The visual language was identical. The skeletal remains, the flat, dusted streets, the total absence of organic material. It felt like I was looking at a crime scene where the weapon used didn't exist yet. I needed to know how the experts explained this. Surely, architectural historians had noticed that the rubble was missing. Surely structural engineers had questioned why the stone buildings pulverized, while the wooden ones merely burned. I dove into the academic literature. I wanted to find the debate. I wanted to find the controversy. I found silence. It wasn't that the information was hidden. It was that it was categorized in a way that discouraged anyone from looking closely. The dynamiting of San Francisco is treated in the history books as a regrettable side note. It is the oops of the 20th century. The narrative goes like this. The Army, in a panic, used dynamite. They were untrained. They used too much. They accidentally spread the fire. End of story. Acknowledge, categorize, move on. This is the mechanism of erasure. It is not active suppression. There are no men in black suits burning documents. It is passive dismissal. By labeling the event as incompetence, you remove the need to analyze the precision of the destruction. If it was just a mistake, there's no pattern to find. But the pattern was there. I went to the library archives and pulled the physical reports from the post-disaster commissions. I read the testimony of the insurance adjusters, my original research subjects, who were now screaming from the pages in a different context. They weren't just complaining about fraud. They were complaining about the Army. The soldiers are blowing up buildings that are not on fire, one adjuster wrote to his head office in Hartford. They are destroying the evidence of the quake damage and the fire damage alike. They are leveling the city. I looked for the investigations into these claims. There were none. The insurance companies eventually settled. The city rebuilt, and the complaints were filed away in boxes marked miscellaneous correspondence. I started to look for the why. Why would the incentives align to ignore this? It became clear quickly. For the city leaders, the fire was a better story than the earthquake. If the city was destroyed by a quake, investors wouldn't return. The ground is unstable. It's a bad bet. But if the city was destroyed by a fire, fire is a solvable problem. You build better water mains. You ban wood roofs. You can rebuild a city destroyed by fire. You cannot fix the ground. So, the fire narrative became the shield. And the army's dynamiting, even though it destroyed the most valuable real estate in the West, was folded into that narrative. It was the heroic effort that failed, rather than the primary engine of destruction. But there was a deeper silence here, a silence regarding the buildings themselves. I began to look at what exactly was destroyed. The logs said hotels, banks, libraries. The photos showed heavy masonry structures, stone arches, domes, columns. These were not the hasty, wooden structures of a gold rush boomtown. San Francisco in 1906 was only 50 years old. In 1849, it was a tent city on a mudflat. We are told that in 5 decades, this population of prospectors, gamblers, and immigrants built a metropolis of stone that rivaled Paris or Rome. I started to look at the construction records. I wanted to see the photos of these massive buildings being built. If they were built between 1850 and 1900, there should be thousands of photos of the construction sites. There should be photos of the scaffolding, the quarries, the laying of the foundations. I found very few. There are some, yes. A photo of a steel frame here, a cornerstone ceremony there. But for the sheer density of stone architecture that existed in the pre-1906 photos, the construction record is surprisingly thin. And the way the historians talk about these buildings is strange. They describe them as neoclassical or Beaux-Arts, listing the architects and the dates. But they never discuss the logistics. They never ask how a city with limited rail access and a population of less than 500,000 people managed to quarry, transport, and erect millions of tons of granite and marble in such a short window of time. They acknowledge the buildings existed. They acknowledge they were destroyed. They move on to the rebuilding. The silence isn't about the fire. The silence is about the origin of the city itself. And the more I looked at the photos of the destruction, the more it felt like the dynamiting wasn't about saving the city. It was about removing something that didn't fit the timeline. I needed to get closer. I couldn't walk through the ruins of 1906, but I could measure them. I gathered every high-resolution photograph of pre-disaster San Francisco I could find. I imported them into photogrammetry software. I wanted to verify the scale. You see, when you look at an old black and white photo, your brain fills in the gaps. You assume a door is a normal door. You assume a window is a normal window. You assume the people standing in front of the building are average height. I started setting reference points. I used the known height of an average man in 1900, about 5 feet 7 inches. I placed digital measuring sticks next to the figures in the photos, and then projected those measurements onto the buildings behind them. The numbers didn't make sense. I measured the entrance to the Crocker Bank. The doors were 14 feet high. I checked again. Maybe it was a perspective distortion. I adjusted the vanishing points. I ran the calculation again, 14 feet. I measured the windows on the ground floor. They started 4 feet off the ground and extended up to 12 feet. I measured the steps. In some of the older government buildings, the ones that were targeted first by the dynamite, the rise of the stairs was roughly 8 to 10 inches. That's steep. A standard modern stair riser is about 7 inches. An 8 or 10-inch rise forces you to march. It's uncomfortable for a person of average height. It feels big. I moved to the interior shots, the lobbies, the hallways. We are told these were grand spaces. Ceremonial. Aesthetic. That's the official explanation for why a door handle is placed 4.5 feet off the ground instead of 3. Grandeur. But I looked at the back hallways, the service corridors, the spaces where no public ceremony ever took place, the spaces where form follows function. The doorways in the service corridors were 12 feet high. Why? Why would a developer in the 1880s, trying to maximize profit in a boomtown, waste money on 12-foot doors in a service hallway? Why build a ceiling 20 feet high in a clerk's office? It creates a heating nightmare. It wastes materials. It makes the space harder to clean, unless they didn't build it. I started measuring the Palace Hotel. This was the crown jewel of San Francisco, a monster of a building, 7 stories high, hundreds of bay windows. It was advertised as the largest hotel in the world. I measured the brickwork. Based on the pixel count of the bricks visible in the high-res scans, the bricks appeared larger than standard. I measured the archways of the courtyard. They were colossal. The scale was not just luxurious, it was wrong. It felt like a building designed for a race of people who were about 8 feet tall. And then I looked at the people in the photos, the San Franciscans of 1905. They looked small. They looked like children wandering through a movie set designed for giants. They crowded into the bottom third of the frame. They didn't occupy the space. They swarmed in it. I mapped the location of these oversized buildings. The Palace Hotel, the Call Building, the City Hall, the Mint. They formed a cluster, a specific dense core of heavy, stone, Tartarian-style architecture. And when I overlaid the dynamite map again, the correlation was perfect. General Funston didn't just blow up buildings. He blew up the big buildings. He blew up the buildings with the 12-foot doors. He blew up the buildings with the impossible granite blocks. The fire breaks weren't random. They were an excision. It was surgery. The official narrative says the dynamite was used to stop the fire. But looking at the measurements, looking at the sheer impossibility of the architecture, relative to the timeline of the city's founding, another possibility began to form in my mind. What if the dynamite wasn't there to stop the fire? What if the fire was the excuse to use the dynamite? I went back to the logs. I wanted to see if anyone else had noticed the strangeness of the architecture before it was destroyed. I wanted to see how these buildings were described in the years leading up to 1906. And that's when I ran into the erasure. It starts with the maps. I pulled up the Sanborn Fire Insurance maps. These are the gold standard for historical research. They are incredibly detailed, showing every structure, its material, its height, and its function. I looked at the 1899 map of the financial district. I compared it to the 1907 map, the post-disaster map. Obviously, the buildings were gone, but it was the labels that caught my attention. In the 1899 map, there are buildings labeled simply as Old Stone Structure or Public Hall. There are massive footprints labeled ruins, even before the earthquake. Wait, I zoomed in. Ruins of former foundation. In 1899? In a city that was supposedly brand new? I checked other maps. Some reference works from the 1880s refer to ancient excavations near the Cliff House. Ancient? The city was 30 years old at the time. How could anything be ancient? I went to the encyclopedias. I looked for descriptions of the construction of the Palace Hotel. I wanted to find the name of the quarry. I wanted to find the shipping manifest for the stone. The entry in the 1902 encyclopedia was detailed. It praised the grandeur, the luxury. I checked the 1920 edition of the same encyclopedia. The entry was shortened. It mentioned the fire. It mentioned the rebuilding. I checked a 1950 edition. The description of the original building was gone, replaced by a single line about the new hotel built on the site. It was subtle. It wasn't that they denied the building existed. It was that they stopped talking about how it was built. They stopped using words like ancient or monolithic. They started using words like temporary and plaster. This was the key. I found a brochure for the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition. This was the World's Fair held in San Francisco just 9 years after the total destruction of the city. The official story is that San Francisco, rising like a phoenix, built a massive Roman-style city of domes and towers in a swampy area of the Presidio to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal. The buildings were officially designated as temporary. They were made of staff, a mixture of plaster and hemp fiber. They were meant to last for 1 year and then be torn down. I looked at photos of the Palace of Fine Arts. It is the only structure from the fair that was left standing. It is still there today. It is made of stone. They tell us it was rebuilt in the 1960s to make it permanent. But I found photos of it in 1920, 5 years after the fair. It hadn't dissolved. It hadn't melted in the rain. It looked solid. It looked ancient. And then I found the demolition photos of the other fair buildings. The Tower of Jewels. The Palace of Horticulture. They were dynamiting them. Why do you need dynamite to take down a temporary plaster shed? You can knock down plaster with a sledgehammer. You can pull it down with a truck. In the grainy photos of the 1916 demolition of the fairgrounds, I saw the same clouds of dust I saw in 1906. I saw the same massive resistance to collapse. I saw steel frames that looked far too heavy for a temporary art exhibit. The thought struck me, and it was a cold, heavy thought. What if the 1915 World's Fair wasn't a construction project? What if it was a renovation project? What if those massive Roman buildings weren't built for the fair? What if they were the survivors? What if the temporary label was the lie they used to justify destroying the last remnants of the old city after the public had said their goodbyes? Come see the marvels. Enjoy the Roman grandeur. Okay, show's over. It's all fake. We have to tear it down now. It's the perfect crime. You hide the evidence in plain sight. You let everyone celebrate it, and then you destroy it under the guise of cleaning up. I went back to the maps. I started looking for a specific type of label. I was looking for waterworks, gasworks, power station. In the pre-1906 maps, there are massive industrial complexes labeled powerhouse. They have smokestacks. They have complex geometries. But when I looked at the interior photos of these powerhouses, I didn't see coal furnaces. I didn't see standard boilers. I saw massive, open halls with tiled floors and domed ceilings. They looked like cathedrals. The labels on the maps changed over time. In 1880, it's a public bath. In 1890, it's a power station. In 1906, it's a ruin. In 1907, it's gone. The function changes, but the form remains the same until they blow it up. And that's when I found the newspaper reports, not the retrospective histories written by academics 50 years later. I went to the scanned microfiche of the Oakland Tribune and the Sacramento Bee from the days immediately following the disaster. I wasn't looking for the big headlines about the fire. I was looking for the small stories on page 4, the police blotters, the letters to the editor. I found a report from April 20th, 1906. Strange discovery in basement of ruined mint, I read on. Workmen clearing the debris report finding tunnels extending deep beneath the foundation, lined with copper and unknown alloy. The military has cordoned off the area. Another report from April 22nd. Soldiers seize artifacts. Residents of the Western Addition complain that Army patrols are confiscating metallic items and tools found in the rubble, claiming they are looted property, even when presented by the homeowners themselves. The pattern was shifting from destruction to collection. They weren't just destroying buildings, they were harvesting something. I pulled up every mention of tunnels, copper, or strange metal I could find in the 6-month period following the quake. The list grew. Tunnels under the Russian Hill, tunnels connecting the hotels, large metallic mechanisms found fused into the bedrock. And then, just as abruptly as they appeared, the reports stopped. By July 1906, the newspapers went silent on the tunnels. The focus shifted entirely to the City Beautiful movement and the new architectural plans. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The editors stopped printing the letters. The reporters stopped asking about the copper-lined basements. But the maps were only the beginning of what disappeared. The physical removal of the city was matched by a bibliographic removal of its history. And as I dug deeper into the silence of the summer of 1906, I realized that the earthquake wasn't just a demolition. It was a heist. But a heist of what? I needed to see the objects. If they were taking things, where did they go? You can't hide millions of tons of granite, but you can hide the smaller things, the tools, the fixtures, the evidence of how the city really worked. And that's when I started finding the auction catalogs. I started searching for the dispersals. If a civilization is being erased, the portable assets have to go somewhere. You can pulverize the stone, you can melt the steel frames, but the contents, the art, the books, the machinery, the furniture, those things tend to migrate. I began combing through the auction records of 1906, 1907, and 1908. I looked at the catalogs from the major auction houses in New York, London, and Chicago. I was looking for a surge. If San Francisco was truly destroyed, there should be nothing to sell. But if it was being looted under the cover of martial law, the market would be flooded with high-quality items labeled Provenance Unknown or Private Collection California. The surge was there. In the autumn of 1906, the East Coast market saw a sudden influx of classical and old-world architectural salvage, marble fireplaces, giant mahogany doors, bronze statuary. The descriptions in the catalogs were vague. Recovered from a western estate. Salvaged from fire. But I looked at the dimensions. One catalog listed a pair of carved oak doors, 14 feet high. Another listed a bronze chandelier, 12 feet in diameter. Who buys a 12-foot chandelier for a private home in 1906? The scale was institutional, but the items were being sold as residential decor. It suggested that the buildings these items came from were not office buildings as we understand them, but something hybrid, residential palaces built on a scale we no longer use. I tracked a specific set of items, the swag lamps. If you look at the pre-disaster photos of San Francisco, specifically the Market Street and Van Ness Avenue corridors, you see these street lamps. They are not the simple gaslights you see in movies about Victorian London. They are complex, multi-armed iron structures. They often have no visible gas lines and no electrical wires connecting them to overhead poles. They stand alone. In the photos taken during the aftermath, the ones showing the soldiers guarding the ruins, the lamps are often gone, not knocked over, removed. The bases are there, bolted to the sidewalk, but the poles are missing. I found a reference in a 1907 scrap metal manifest from the Port of Oakland. 400 tons of decorative iron, tubular. It was shipped to a foundry in Pennsylvania to be melted down. Why ship scrap iron across the country when you have a rebuilding city that needs steel right there? You only ship it away if you want it to disappear. You only ship it away if the metallurgy itself is something you don't want local engineers examining. This brought me back to the newspapers. The physical erasure was being matched by a narrative blackout. But in the chaos of April and May, the blackout wasn't perfect. The censors were overwhelmed. I dug deeper into the Oakland Tribune. Oakland is across the bay. It wasn't under Funston's martial law. The reporters there were interviewing the refugees who had fled the city by ferry. On April 24, 1906, I found a small column on page 3. The headline was, "Refugees Tell of Army Excesses." The text described a shopkeeper named H.L. Mencken, not the famous writer, just a local merchant who claimed he was held at bayonet point while soldiers removed the machinery from his basement before setting the charges to blow up his building. He screamed that the building was stone, that it wouldn't burn, that the fire was 10 blocks away. They blew it up anyway. What machinery? He was a dry goods merchant. Why did he have machinery in his basement that the army wanted? I found another report from a Sacramento paper. A dairy farmer outside the city reported seeing military wagons moving at night, covered in canvas, heavy laden, heading toward the Presidio. The timeline of these reports is crucial. They cluster in the first 3 weeks. By June, they vanish. The editor of the San Francisco Chronicle, who had initially been critical of the lack of water, suddenly published a series of editorials praising General Funston as the savior of the city. What happened in that interval? I looked at the financial records again. The insurance payouts started arriving in June. The federal relief funds were released in June. The silence was purchased. If you wanted your check, you stopped talking about the soldiers looting your basement. You stopped talking about the dynamited safe deposit boxes. You agreed that it was a fire, and you took the money to rebuild. But the physical evidence of what happened to the materials themselves is harder to bribe. I turned my attention to the clinkers. This is a term used by brick collectors and historical masons. A clinker is a brick that has been overfired. In a kiln, if a brick gets too hot, it starts to melt. It vitrifies. It turns into a dark, glassy, twisted lump. It rings like metal when you hit it. You can find clinker bricks all over the Bay Area. They are used as decorative garden walls in houses built in the 1920s. They are sold as earthquake bricks. The story is that the Great Fire was so hot, it melted the city's brick supply. I talked to a ceramics engineer. I asked him about the melting point of standard red clay brick. You need about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit to start vitrification, he told me. To get the liquidity required to fuse a pile of bricks into a single glass lump, you need sustained temperatures closer to 2,500 degrees. I checked the temperature of a wood-fueled house fire. It peaks at around 1,100 degrees. Maybe 1,400 if there's a draft. What about a coal fire? I asked. Hotter, he said. Maybe 1,800. But you need a forced draft. You need a bellows. An open-air fire loses heat to the atmosphere. I looked at the photos of the clinkers again. There are walls in San Francisco where the bricks have flowed like candle wax. There are bottles fused into the masonry. This is not the result of a burning sofa. This is not the result of a gas main explosion. Gas burns hot, but it flashes. It doesn't sustain the heat long enough to melt 1,000,000 tons of masonry. The presence of the clinkers suggests the presence of an accelerant. Something that burns hotter than wood. Something that burns hotter than coal. I looked at the steel. In the debris photos, and in the few surviving artifacts of the steel frame buildings, the beams are not just bent. Warping is normal in a fire. Steel loses its structural integrity at around 1,000 degrees. It gets soft. It sags. But I found photos of steel beams that looked puddled. They looked like they had been cut with a torch, but on a massive scale. The edges were dripping. This looks like the aftermath of thermite. I am not saying it was thermite. I cannot prove the chemical composition of a fire from 100 years ago. But I can look at the pattern. Thermite is a mixture of rust and aluminum powder. It burns at 4,000 degrees. It cuts through steel like butter. It was known in 1906. It was used for welding train tracks. If you wanted to bring down a steel frame building, a building that you couldn't just knock over with black powder, you would need to cut the columns. The official report says the Army used black powder and dynamite. But the visual evidence of the melted steel and the vitrified brick points to a thermal event far exceeding the capacity of those conventional explosives. And then, there is the lack of char. In a normal fire, things turn black, soot, carbon. In the Lawrence panorama, the ruins are white. The stone is bleached. The ground is gray dust. High-temperature incineration burns off the carbon. If you incinerate a body at high heat, you get white ash. If you burn a building at extreme heat, you get white dust. The color of the ruins tells us the temperature of the event, and the temperature of the event tells us it wasn't a ham and eggs kitchen fire. I started to map the artifacts. Where are the clinkers found? They are found in the same neighborhoods where the dynamite orders were concentrated. The financial district, the Latin Quarter, the zones of the Old World architecture. You don't find clinkers in the wooden residential districts. There, you find char. You find black ruins. So we have two different events happening simultaneously. In the residential outer rings, we have a normal fire. In the stone administrative core, we have a high-temperature thermal event coupled with explosive demolition. The fire was the cover for the event. I kept digging into the artifact collections. I found a melted typewriter in a museum collection. It was a lump of iron and glass. I looked at the model. It was an Underwood No. 5, standard for the era. But next to it, in the same display case, was a carpenter's wrench found in the ruins. I looked at the wrench. It was huge. I estimated the grip size. To hold that wrench comfortably, your hand would need to be about 50% larger than mine. I started looking for other tools. Oversized mallet. Giant shears. They are listed as novelties or promotional items. The explanation is that hardware stores made giant versions of tools to hang in their windows as advertisements. But this wrench had wear marks on the jaws. It had impact marks on the handle. It had been hit with a hammer. It had been used to turn bolts. Who makes a promotional sign out of hardened tool steel and then uses it to build a house? You don't. You use a tool that fits your hand. The artifacts were telling the same story as the doorways. The city that was destroyed was built by, and perhaps for, a population or a workforce that operated at a different scale. The giants weren't myths. They were just the people who poured the concrete and turned the bolts. And when the timeline shifted, when the modern era arrived, the tools were buried, the buildings were blown up, and the history was rewritten. And this brings me to the unifying hypothesis. We have to ask the question, what if the official story is entirely backwards? We are told, the earthquake happened, the fire started, the army tried to save the city, they failed, the city was destroyed, and then it was rebuilt. Hypothesis. The destruction of San Francisco was a planned, controlled demolition of a remnant outpost of a global civilization, often referred to by researchers as Tartaria, that was incompatible with the new historical narrative of the American West. The earthquake provided the opportunity. It was the trigger event. It created the panic and the initial damage necessary to justify martial law. General Funston didn't take charge in a moment of heroism. He executed a pre-planned grid of demolition. The army moved in, not to save the buildings, but to ensure they fell. They targeted the old world structures, the massive stone piles, the domed power plants, the impossible hotels. Because these structures proved that the gold rush narrative was a lie. You cannot build a Roman imperial city in 50 years with horse carts and unskilled labor. The existence of the city contradicted the history books. So the city had to go. They used high-temperature accelerants to weaken the steel and vitrify the masonry, ensuring that the ruins would be nothing but dust and gravel, easy to clear, easy to hide. They used dynamite to drop the shells that remained. They looted the technology, the wireless lamps, the atmospheric energy collectors, which we see as domes, the machinery in the basements, and shipped it east to be reverse-engineered or melted down. Then, they orchestrated the rebuilding. They built a new city on top of the old foundations. They used the remaining Tartarian structures for the 1915 World's Fair, giving them a final purpose, and then destroyed them under the guise of tearing down temporary exhibits. It sounds insane. I know it does. It sounds like science fiction. But look at how it explains the anomalies. It explains the dynamite. Why blow up buildings upwind? Because those were the target buildings. The wind direction didn't matter. The demolition list mattered. It explains the lack of rubble. Controlled demolition and high-heat pulverization turns stone to dust. A gravity collapse leaves a pile. We see dust, not piles. It explains the 1915 exposition. It resolves the paradox of the temporary Palace of Fine Arts being made of permanent stone. It was never temporary. It was a survivor. It explains the speed of the rebuilding. They didn't rebuild from scratch. They renovated. They slapped modern facades on surviving shells. They filled in the 12-foot doors. They lowered the ceilings. Consider the counter-explanations. The strongest counter-argument is the insurance fraud theory. This is the one I started with. It makes sense economically. Everyone wanted a payout, so everyone claimed fire. But insurance fraud doesn't explain the vitrified brick. A homeowner setting his curtains on fire to claim a check cannot generate 2,500 degrees of heat. He cannot melt structural steel. Insurance fraud explains the paperwork. It doesn't explain the physics. The second counter-argument is the incompetence theory. The army was panicked and stupid. But incompetence is chaotic. Incompetence misses. The destruction of the financial district and the civic center was surgical. They didn't blow up the slums. They blew up the palaces. And they did it in a grid. Chaos does not move in a grid. What remains uncertain is the who. I am not claiming that General Funston was a member of a secret society. He may have just been following orders from Washington. He may have been told that the buildings were unsafe. The soldiers planting the charges didn't need to know they were erasing history. They just needed to know they were making a fire break. The compartmentalization of information is how you pull off a conspiracy of this scale. The soldier knows he has to blow up the building. The newspaper editor knows he has to support the rebuilding effort. The historian knows he has to cite the official report. No one person sees the whole picture. Until you stand back, 100 years later, and look at the map. And the map shows a hole where a civilization used to be. I keep thinking about the sheer weight of the stone. The official story asks us to believe that in 1850, San Francisco was a mudflat. In 1870, it was a wooden boomtown. And by 1890, it was a city of granite and marble palaces. Where did the stone come from? I checked the quarry records. The main granite quarry in California at the time was Raymond Granite. I checked their output records for the years 1890 to 1900. Their total output, if every single block was shipped to San Francisco, accounts for maybe 10% of the stone visible in the photographs of the city. Where is the rest? Where are the ships? Where are the trains? The logistics of the construction are just as impossible as the physics of the destruction. We are looking at a phantom city, a city that appeared out of nowhere, fully formed, and was then violently erased. I walked down Market Street yesterday. I stood in front of the modern skyscrapers. I looked down at the sidewalk. In some places, you can see the curbstones. They are old granite. They are worn smooth. They are huge, much larger than modern curbs. I knelt down and looked at the joint where the curb meets the street. The asphalt was peeling back slightly. Underneath the asphalt, I saw cobblestones. And underneath the cobblestones, I saw a cut stone block, massive and pale, disappearing down into the dark. It wasn't a foundation for a road. It was the top of a wall. We are walking on the roof of the old world. The unanswered questions are not just about the past. They are about the ground beneath our feet. Why did they bury the first floor of the city? If you go to other cities, Seattle, Chicago, Portland, you find the same thing. Underground tours, raised streets. They tell us they raised the street level to avoid floods or sewage problems. But in San Francisco, they blew the tops off the buildings and filled the streets with the dust. The question I cannot answer, the question that keeps me awake, is this: what is still down there? If the machinery the soldiers confiscated was portable, they took it. But what about the machinery that was built into the foundations? What about the tunnel systems that the looters found? Did they fill them with concrete? Or are they still there, humming in the dark, beneath the subways and the sewer lines? The official narrative is a thin layer of asphalt over a deep, structural lie. I tried to find the blueprints for the sewers in the financial district. I submitted a request to the city archives. Restricted, the clerk told me. Homeland Security. Why is a sewer map from 1906 a matter of national security? Unless it shows something that isn't a sewer. I am not done. I can't be done. I have found a lead on a private collection in Nevada. A family that claims their grandfather was a demolition engineer for the Army in 1906. They say they have his diary. They say he wrote about the iron rooms he had to breach. I'm going to go see them, but until then, look at the photos. Look at the shadows. Look at the missing rubble. Don't listen to what they tell you happened. Look at what is physically there. And more importantly, look at what is physically missing. Because once you see the hole in the story, you can never unsee it. We are squatters in the ruins of a greatness we cannot comprehend. Convinced we built the castle because we painted the walls, but the paint is peeling, and the stone underneath is starting to show.